Bet Sharukkin, the Son of Perdition, by Alan Bonk. Chapter 10. Egypt, the Canal is mine. Paul was at a meeting in Jerusalem with Israeli government representatives. Their eyes converged on Paul. Judging, simmering, the Israeli leader stated, "Within a week of your meeting with Egypt, Egypt has issued a statement. They are acting on their sovereign rights to restrict Israel's use of the Suez Canal and to anyone else who they choose to. Egypt has made it clear they're not part of the Levant. They are in Africa and are an independent nation. I pointed out that Sinai Peninsula is in the Levant, and Egypt claims it as theirs," Paul said. The Israeli representative exclaimed, "We have a peace agreement with Egypt that requires that Israel have open use of the canal for commercial and military use without exception." Paul was silently fighting the mounting pressure, then said, "Please understand, at first I was simply irritated that they did it, and at this point I'm still not too upset. Egypt is simply pushing back at me. The agreement is a peace treaty. Do you know what that means? If Egypt breaks the treaty, it would be an act of war. We demand that you and NATO represent Israel to the Egyptians. Israel wants to know, what good is our defense security agreement with NATO if the first time there is a problem, you do nothing?" The Israeli representative exclaimed. Paul composed himself coolly, took deep breaths. "It's clear that I'm being pushed to act. After clarifying Egypt's position and being sure that they are entrenched in it, my 10 generals and I will begin planning a response to restore Israel's use of the canal. Israel has destroyed several nations because of Israel's imminent destruction. Egypt is not looking for more war." The Israeli's mood changed. He stood down. Paul cannot move against Egypt without approval from Asher. Paul was in Asher's throne room, in front of his altar. "Father, I ask for your spiritual approval to move against Egypt. My son, this battle needs to be done. This is my order to you. Move quickly, and also have a plan made with NATO Europe. Have them prepared to end the conflict if things go badly. Eliminate Egypt's military and government. Use tactical nuclear weapons if needed. But do not consult Israel," Asher commanded. "Thank you, Father. Everyone in NATO agrees that if Egypt fights back, there should be no Egypt left when it's all over. After all, they're the ones that closed the canal and broke the treaty." Paul bowed and backed away from the throne. 2 weeks later, Paul and the spearhead forces were prepared to move. They were in the Negev desert, just inside Israel's border. Paul spoke into the field radio. "Commence the operation." Paul's tanks and armored vehicles were the latest European and American weapons. Clearly, the advantage lies with NATO and Paul's troops. The Egyptian forces moved to engage, but soon realized it is futile. After the front echelon, the Egyptians began to suffer losses. They moved back quickly. Paul's blitz pushed them back to the canal in just hours. The general who was with Paul told him, We've arrived, sir. Do you want to proceed? Yes, of course. Seize the canal and then push on to Cairo, Paul ordered. Paul crossed the canal on one of his many temporary bridges, feeling victorious. He wanted to teach the Egyptians a lesson. He did not realize that the Egyptians had hidden troops and equipment in emplacements spreading along the west bank of the canal. The Egyptians allowed Paul and most of his forces to pass right by without a fight or detection. Paul and his men traveled all the way to Cairo. The city was nearly deserted. Paul's men looted treasures and valuables, piling them into vehicles. Paul, looking on, consenting. Then Paul heard his spirit consorts whisper to him, "The Egyptians are about to spring an ambush that will destroy the NATO forces." Paul's eyes darted around everywhere. "What is it? Where is it?" Paul belted. Back at the canal border, the Egyptian troops were mustered. They closed in to block the path of retreat. Paul's spirits urged him, "Withdraw immediately. There is no time to wait." The larger Egyptian army began to engage Paul's rear guard. Paul dashed to a commander and shouted, "Go, go, go, it's a trap." They raced the Egyptians to the choke points that they might not escape. Paul got on the radio and gave the order, "Call down fire." As Paul and his forces slipped back into the Negev, the rumbling and shaking can be heard, the smoke rising in the west. Cairo was destroyed. The Egyptian seacoast, the entire Nile Valley was burned behind them. Then silence. No one cheered. Faces were blank. No one talked. It was as if the only noise was the mechanical clanking of tank tracks. Later that day, they stopped in the Negev, near some sand dunes, to reform the equipment and organize for the trip home from the dunes. 2 armored cars and a military jeep. The Israelis came out to meet Paul. They were furious. They had not been consulted. "We did not expect you and NATO to destroy Egypt. The canal was a diplomatic problem, not an excuse for war," yelled one of the Israelis. Paul's eyes were locked with the Israeli. His eyes, the eyes of a beast. He ordered his commander, "Lead the troops back to Assyria." "Yes, sir." They turned and left. Later that night, they camped in northern Arabia, in Paul's command tent. He paced on the edge. His commanders fed off the rage. Paul did not feel anger against Asher, who told him to do it. Instead, he blamed Israel, whom he hated. "How dare they? I'm doing their dirty work. They told me to do something, and I did it," Paul shouted. One of his commanders approached him and exclaimed, "We concur with you on all points. Those Jews used you to save themselves at the expense of Egypt." Another commander stood up and spoke. "You would not have done it if it weren't for the security agreement." Paul muttered, "All those covenant Jews and Christians, I would kill them all if I could." The commanders approached Paul and said, "Give us the direct order, sir, and we will turn back to Israel and destroy her." Paul stood to his feet and commanded, "Make the plans to approach to Israel." The generals all stood up and saluted Paul. They cleared the tables, maps and charts laid out. Paul smirked totally vindicated. The next day, military vehicles began to move towards the west, to Israel. Paul, in his command vehicle, stared out the window when the commander with him handed him the field phone. "From NATO headquarters, sir. The Americans are demanding you stand down and withdraw," said the commander. "What right do the Americans have meddling in my affairs?" asked Paul. "It seems that Israel still has an ally. Don't you understand that the Americans could make short work of us should they want to?" the commander said. "They should keep their values to themselves," muttered Paul. "Sir, there are 3 American aircraft carriers setting off the coast of Israel, waiting orders, sir," the commander informed. Paul muttered, "I will come back, and when I do, there will be no one able to stop me." Weeks later, a meeting and dinner in Paul's personal residence in Nineveh. It was the end of the supper. The dinner guests were 10 hardened men of different nationalities. They're Paul's military strike group. Paul spoke. "I thank you all again for joining me, gentlemen." He raised his glass. "Now, allow me to get to business. I need to get input. What might be done to destroy Israel?" The 4 Arab partners were quick and said, "We've been trying to destroy Israel for years. Perhaps our northern commanders will do better than us." "Yes, we must," agreed Paul. The first northern commander responded, "For many years, NATO has been an uncertain alliance. We may use this to our advantage." "Go on," Paul said. The commander continued, "All alliances have common goals in order to be strong when under pressure. Early in the alliance, the enemy and the goals were clear: to keep the Soviet Union out of Western Europe. But since the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, American and European NATO have often disagreed. The United States had to operate unilaterally more and more, as the European NATO would drag their feet. For the Europeans, they needed, or at least wanted, the American dollars. So, no official change in policy." Paul asked, "So NATO has little or no clout to make America move one way or the other?" "Correct. The only advantage they have on the Americans is the alliance itself. The Europeans are intimate with America's military and defenses. They have all the codes and strategies for defense. To put it plainly," the commander explained. "Oh," Paul interrupted, "they could betray America, and she would be destroyed." A second northern commander entered the conversation. "But NATO Europe does not have the necessary number of assets, nukes, required to guarantee a total victory. The United States is a massive nation with industry and population centers all over. So, NATO would eventually have to approach the Russians for additional firepower." The first northern commander responded, "This idea is not as crazy as you might think. The Russians, who have long been part of NATO, back in 2002, the NATO-Russian Council was designed to allow Russia and European NATO to work together. The council was played down by most of the parties, and there were difficulties along the way. However, Russia has stated that they desire that someday they would be a full member in the alliance." At this point in the meeting, a third commander stood up. The other commanders turned and focused on him. The third commander spoke up. The subject of America's demise has already been discussed with the Russians, and they concur and are actually waiting for NATO. The Russians have been open to the idea for years. The plans and targets have already been formulated. And, sir, if you give the word, the final details and schedule will come easily. America will be made totally defenseless. There's only one caveat. With Israel's ally gone, Russia wants the honor of eliminating Israel herself. They have desired to do this since the 60s. Paul stood up, lifted his glass, and remarked, "Consider it done." End of chapter 10.